Hello and welcome to the Gifted Ed Podcasts. We are your hosts,
Angel Van Howe, Gifted Coordinator and SEL Facilitator,
and Meghan McCarthy, Social Worker. We are grateful for the opportunity to share this space with you today as we talk about the complexities of giftedness. Today, we would like to wrap up our series on perfectionism with our own reflections of what we have learned while listening to our Voices in the Trenches episodes.
What sort of challenges and behaviors do you see our students experiencing? So thinking about Jenny's response and how anxiety presents itself in physical forms, from a student picking her eyelashes or pulling hair, got me thinking about how much I'm concerned for students who don't present what they're experiencing internally, because then teachers and adults have no way of knowing what they're experiencing and what standards they're holding themselves to, and how they're responding to not achieving those standards inside.
I definitely appreciated that. And I think to me that kind of spoke to a lot of the social comparison too that exists, whether intentional or not intentional. And I think for me, kind of what I reflected on from that is, especially being a social worker, I try to be so intentional and so aware of the wording I use when I check in with students. So if there's a student I've worked with who I know there's a big test coming up or a project coming up, and I want to see how it went, when I check in with that student, if I say something like, what grade did you get on that test versus how did you feel when taking that test, I feel like I'm communicating what I value more based on those two responses. And if I want to put more emphasis on the process part of it, questions like, how did you feel preparing for that test? How did you feel taking that test? And that bringing in that self-reflection piece, I feel like gets at more the process versus the outcome and what I value and what we're putting pressure on too.
Yeah, I agree with you. That makes a lot of sense, because I think if you don't focus on the process, then you're focusing more on this binary view of what success and failure is.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
And so that growth process piece is missing, and that's what we want them to engage with.
Yeah.
Because that's how we can achieve excellence.
Yes.
By taking risks and by, dealing with all of those emotions.
And then taking that into what Sarah had mentioned about students, some of our students, they know a lot and they're not used to a challenge, or they're not used to not knowing. I kind of just took that and reflected on really putting myself in their shoes and giving such a greater context to their potential anxiety of really not having much experience, not knowing, and how offsetting that can be when you're going into a new challenging task, project, quiz, what have you, with your peers who might seemingly on the outside look like they're getting it right away.
Mm-hmm. I agree. And we have all seen that reluctance or avoidance or fear when gifted students feel like they can't engage in that growth mindset process.
Mm-hmm. What speaks to me with what Elizabeth had shared is I just really appreciated kind of like the nudge, I guess, is how I took it, to take a step back and look at the classroom learning environment and how she's been able to create such a safety to take risks just because there's an inherent expectation that you're going to make a mistake. Everyone in this space will make a mistake, and it's not linked to failure. It's linked to your learning a language. You're going to make mistakes.
Right. And everyone starts off in unknown territory, so they haven't developed these perfectionistic standards because they don't know what the language should sound like. Right?
Yeah.
Just wanted to touch on what Jenny mentioned in terms of the uncomfortable feelings that are associated with learning and risk-taking for perfectionists. What type of judgment do they assign to their emotions? At times, we feel embarrassed when we make mistakes, but do we stop it there, or do we attach a narrative? And then does that narrative become judgmental? And if that narrative becomes judgmental, are we going to be more inclined to take a risk or not take a risk?
Yeah. And I think then kind of the feelings you have about yourself, right, based on that. So whether it's embarrassment or whatever emotions kind of surface, I liked the strategy shared about goal setting, because I think that could take kind of give a place to put it in a way. So if teachers or parents alongside their students help them goal set and set a goal that's at an appropriate challenge level, we can start feeling a little bit more success in the areas that are fearful to start. versus the shutdown, I don't want to do it kind of resistance at times that students can show. But I think that goal setting can be such a powerful strategy if it's an appropriate goal. And that, I think, is when they were saying, you have to know your students and you have to know your child. I think that's so key to know. If it's too easy, there's no interest, there's no buy-in. But it has to be not too challenging where they can feel success at something that's hard and difficult.
No, I agree with you. And I was also thinking about what Sarah mentioned in terms of providing vocabulary and for how to view the growth mindset.
Yeah.
Right. In terms of, I think the quote was, if I'm not mistaken, a brain stretching opportunity, excuse me. And I really like that because a lot of times I think students don't know how to view a challenge. And so if we give them the vocabulary and we give them the framework through an experience of a story, something that they can relate to, then they're more inclined to approach it without maybe that anxiety.
Yeah. And I think just coming back to, again, how we communicate, right? And so redefining, instead of, like you said, the brain stretching for the word challenge, or defining what success is.
Well, and that on the flip side of that, defining what failure is.
Yeah.
Because I think if you have a perfectionist mindset, you're going to equate failure differently than somebody with an excellence mindset.
Yep.
I mean, is failure if you make one mistake?
Right.
Is failure that you forgot to put a period at the end of the sentence?
Yeah.
What is failure?
Right.
Especially with gifted children, we need to dive a little deeper and understand their perspective. Although we may have our own, but where are they coming from?
Yeah. And I think setting expectations for things that seem inherent potentially, right? Because we have our own definition of what success is, our own definition of failure. And then we maybe assume too much of that it's too alike to the people around us. So just setting the expectation that I expect you to make a mistake. I expect you to not know. That's a good thing.
And I really like how Elizabeth mentioned that, she puts a lot of communication out on the front end to set the expectations of, the rate of progress. You're going to come into a foreign language and it's not going to be comfortable and you're going to make a lot of mistakes. This is what's expected.
So when Angel and I were reflecting on the teachers' responses to like the spectrum of responses they see in their classroom related to perfectionism, we had heard, I think it was Jenny who used positive perfectionism. And when we were thinking of the behavior she outlined within that, we wanted to kind of link back to a previous episode we did when we talked about excellence versus perfectionism, and thinking that some of the behaviors that we see that maybe we call positive perfectionism might actually fall within the excellence realm, because I think it can have probably many different names when we look at what we're observing in the classroom.
I just think it's important always to look at the behaviors, right? Because that's where we're really going to get the signals of what path or pursuit we're on.
And looking at the behaviors, whether they're lending more to the process versus the outcome.
The outcome. Yeah. Absolutely. I agree.
And there is, I think, a lot of overlap within perfectionism and excellence at a glance. But when we're looking at the impact, like you said, on the behaviors, that can kind of decipher which angle that you're kind of referring to.
I agree. I was thinking about what Elizabeth had mentioned in terms of new students coming into French and how her current students have accepted that they're not going to know 100% of what she says. They just won't know it. And how new students have the expectation that everybody else knows it, and I should be knowing just as much as they do. And I think that's another, again, a behavior and pattern of perfectionism, is that you have these inappropriate expectations that you put on yourself when you compare yourself to your peers, irrespective of, how much experience or exposure your peers have had to a topic or content. So I just really appreciated that she sees that and that she supports that spectrum of needs. Because that can be very difficult to do, especially, when you have a student who comes a lot later in fifth or sixth or seventh or eighth, right? And everybody else has been there for quite some time.
That background knowledge and just experience and exposure.
So I wanted to share some of my big takeaways today with you. Perfectionists have a hard time with failure because it may affect their self-worth. While pursuing the path of excellence, failure doesn't have the same effect because it's about changing behaviors and choices versus who or what you are in terms of identity.
And then looking at how perfectionism can impact social groups. If we look at small group work or partner work that is often happens a lot in schools, the complexities that can come up and challenges that can come up with that happen almost in lower school and in middle school regularly. And thinking of it now from the lens of perfectionism, I'm really curious how many conflicts arise due to the differences in expectations. I think both if a student sides more or aligns themselves more with perfectionism versus excellence, I think the end result, the goal is the same of wanting to turn in a really great project, but how they get there can be so different.
And I think perfectionists would really struggle with group work, right? In terms of their level of expectations may far surpass their peers, and their ability to be flexible and allow mistakes to happen, or even learning styles, how to incorporate that into their perfectionistic plan can be very challenging for them.
Yeah. I think another piece that really hit me was how much little space students who identify as perfectionists give themselves to celebrate success. It seems like the end result is the focus on what went wrong or what they didn't do or what they could do differently next time, which then results in either a student shutting down and giving up, or an overfocus and overcorrection on never making that mistake again. And that those maladaptive behaviors that could come from that can really hinder one's resiliency and creativity in the learning process.
So creativity is open-ended and divergent in nature, right? And is especially hard for perfectionists because there's not a game plan then, right? If we don't have one convergent way to do this, one right way to do this, how am I expected to be creative? So I think it could be very helpful sharing maybe different models or different vocabulary with students who struggle with perfectionism. I'm thinking of Paul Torrance right now. And Paul Torrance's work connects to 4 elements of creativity: fluency, which is the number of ideas; flexibility, the variety of ideas; originality, the uniqueness of ideas; and elaboration, the details of ideas. So even using this framework and vocabulary can be helpful in terms of explaining, how am I supposed to be creative? And I know that sounds silly, but if you're a perfectionist and you're used to, getting everything correct and right, when somebody tells you now you can think divergently, now there are multiple ways to arrive at a destination, that's completely overwhelming.
Right.
Because with all of those different ways to get there are a different set of expectations, and they all have to be perfect. So it can just be extremely overwhelming.
Yeah. I think going with that note, kind of more of a personal takeaway that I got from these previous episodes on perfectionism is something that my husband and I do at home during dinner at night with our kids. We are really trying to be as intentional as possible with our wording of questions and how we interact with our students with our kids about their school day and just challenges. And so we'll often ask questions like, everyone go around, share something that they're proud of that day or something they did that was kind for someone else. And I really now want to make sure that I'm also asking, tell me a mistake you made today, and really practicing sitting with how uncomfortable that could potentially be depending on what that mistake is, because it just really seems like there's so many great strategies that have been noted in the past few episodes. But the biggest piece that I just keep coming back to is I think the greatest impact will be if we can normalize mistakes in all the settings that our students experience: sports, school, home, clubs, activities, to really have the greatest impact long term.
I agree with you, because I think perfectionists can be very resistant to those uncomfortable emotions, right? Because we don't know how to navigate them, or maybe we feel like those emotions aren't acceptable. So providing that experience, I think, on a daily basis would definitely pave the way for excellence. We want to thank you for joining us in this space today. Please subscribe to the Gifted Ed podcast to stay up to date with our latest episodes. Stay tuned for our next episode as we continue to unpack the complexities of giftedness.